Citizenship in the empire meant that potentially seditious elements in Syria, or Spain, or Greece would now see their interests aligned with Rome's. Caesar had the vision to see that the empire would not survive if it remained simply a Roman empire. It must embrace its growing multi-ethnic character, or it would inevitably fracture. To this end, he also expanded the ranks of the depleted Senate to some 1,000 members, and to the horror of old conservatives, welcomed into the august body important, read, loyal to Caesar, men from across the empire, regardless of their national origins. After taking care of all of these human questions, enfranchisement, grain doles, colonization, Caesar turned to the physical infrastructure of the empire. The city had been crumbling, and as in the case of the old Senate House, been deliberately destroyed in the chaos of the previous few years. Caesar initiated a slew of public works projects, rebuilding and expanding the neglected city. But he had his eye not just on Rome itself. Caesar personally drew up plans for an expanded and rationalized harbor at the poorly conceived but vitally important port of Ostia. He also initiated a program to drain the swamps around Italy, which he saw as little more than factories for malaria. The modernization program was bold and far-reaching, but perhaps his boldest and farthest-reaching program was to reimagine the nature of time itself. Since its inception, Rome had operated on a lunar calendar. To handle the lag between the 355-day lunar year and the 365-day solar year, the high priests were forever inserting holy days to keep the months and years aligned. But in the chaos of the war years, the calendar had been neglected and things were completely out of whack. Caesar decided to prevent this from ever happening again by officially moving Rome onto a solar calendar. Using a Greek astronomer's calculations, he declared a 12-month, 365-day year with a leap day scheduled every 4 years. Sound familiar? The Julian calendar would remain in effect in the West until the 1500s, when it was tweaked by Pope Gregory to reflect the subtle drift of the equinoxes over the centuries. But in substance, we live today in the calendar that Julius Caesar declared unilaterally in 46 BC. The month of July, Julii, should tell us everything we need to know about the impact of Caesar's vision. There is little doubt that Caesar's reforms had a net positive impact on the empire, and coupled with the subsequent overhauls initiated by Augustus, his policy set the stage for another 5 centuries of Roman dominance over the Mediterranean basin. But there was still the little matter of how all of these necessary reforms were being executed. It had been 500 years since the Romans had driven out Tarquinius Superbus and founded their republic, believing that never again should one man hold absolute power over his countrymen. On what authority was Caesar really acting? What were his real intentions? When the crowds in the street hailed him as Rex, was he waving off their attempts to crown him, or waving off their attempts to crown him as simply premature? Next week, we will get more into the specifics of Caesar's legal authority through this period, but suffice it to say that a growing contingent of the waning nobility did not believe for a second Caesar's claim that he would restore the old order as soon as order itself was restored. When a group of senators called on Caesar one afternoon and he did not rise to greet them as equal, but instead remained seated in an orderly fashion, they saw their worst fears confirmed. Caesar was aiming to make himself a king and a god, and he must be stopped. And though Caesar was clearly aiming for immortality, they knew that in fact he was just a man who could and must be killed. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 46, Sic Semper Tyrannis. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar stayed in Rome for an extended period for the first time since heading to Gaul some 12 years earlier. During the summer, he was joined by Queen Cleopatra, who visited the city as an honored guest. Somewhat awkwardly for Caesar, she brought with her the product of their affair, a small boy nicknamed Caesarion, or Little Caesar, who would prove to be the great general's only son. Though Cicero found her infuriating, and Calpurnia could not have been happy, to see her husband's lover parading around their illegitimate child, Cleopatra charmed the city and was formally made a friend of Rome by the Senate. The Roman envelopment of Egypt, long sought and long staved off by bribery, was now official. Through the spring and summer, Caesar worked furiously on his reform projects, trying to salvage the Roman economy and restore stability to the empire. I would like to thank alert listener Dave for pointing out an error I made last week in recounting the changes to the calendar. It turns out that Caesar actually got his math wrong and inserted a leap day every 3 years rather than every 4 years. The mistake would stand for another 30 years until the reforms of Augustus. And speaking of corrections, I would also like to thank alert and longtime listener Detlef for pointing out that I got crossed up on my Roman numerals a few episodes back and referred to Mithridates the Great as Mithridates the Sixth rather than Mithridates the Fourth. Thanks, guys, for helping me keep everything straight. At this point, Caesar still officially served as co-consul with Lepidus as his colleague and had not yet embraced the full-time role of dictator that he would be remembered for. But while technically he was just another average Republican executive, in reality, the word of mere consul Julius Caesar was the undisputed law of the land. It felt good to finally wield the power he had sought for so long, and it felt doubly good that for the first time in years, there were no enemies on the horizon threatening to take it all away. As he remade the city, though, he received new reports of trouble in Spain. At first, he hoped to simply brush them aside. He had won the war. He was in power. He did not want to hear that the sons of Pompey were raising more legions in Hispania to challenge his rule. Finally, though, he was forced to acknowledge the problem when word came that the ragtag remnants of the Senate's North African army was now 13 legions strong. Sigh. So in the autumn of 46 BC, Caesar set out from the city once again with 2 of his veteran legions, marching to Spain in less than a month, gathering recruits along the way and joining with a force that had been raised in anticipation of his arrival. In the end, he marshaled some 40,000 to face off against the 70,000 raised by the Pompeys. Outnumbered again. Sigh. But the speed of his advance had taken his enemies by surprise, and Caesar was able to reclaim much of the territory taken by the Pompey brothers. With Caesar in country, and clearly every bit the general he had always been, soldiers on the other side began to get nervous and defect in droves. The Pompeys found themselves forced to challenge Caesar in battle immediately. If they waited any longer, they risked losing their whole army to defection. So in March of 45 BC, on a slope outside the fortified city of Munda, the two sides met. Caesar was in the weaker position, but like always he acted boldly and ordered his legions to charge up the hill. The battle was an extremely hard-fought, bloody affair. Caesar himself was recorded to have said afterwards that while he usually fought for victory, at Munda he fought for his life. Indeed, the battle was going against him for quite a while, until he personally took charge of the right wing and rallied his beleaguered troops. The Pompeians reinforced the line in the face of Caesar's counterattack, but wound up losing the left as a result, allowing Caesar's cavalry to break through and surround them. Engulfed, the Pompeian army broke. The final numbers of 30,000 dead Pompeians to a mere 1,000 for Caesar hide how close Caesar came to losing everything. But what hid nothing was the 13 legionary standard Caesar captured. Military resistance in Spain was shattered, and the sons of Pompey fled. One would be captured a few months later and executed, while the other would remain on the run for another decade before being caught and executed by Octavian. Caesar remained in Spain for a few months, consolidating his rule and repairing the damage done by the corrupt and ruthless governor he had left in charge after winning the province in 49 BC. Then, with autumn approaching and the situation in Spain dealt with, Caesar and his entourage headed back to Rome. Unlike his return to the city after the Alexandrian campaign, or after his victory at Thapsus, when he headed back to the capital this time, nowhere in the whole of the empire did there lurk an enemy army to challenge him. This time, he really was the undisputed master of Rome. But of course, it does not take an army to bring down a single man. With every opposition army destroyed, Caesar's enemies turned to conspiracy. The object now was not to defeat Caesar, but to kill him. At first, it was only a hardcore contingent of enemies who thirsted for Caesar's blood, but his attitude after becoming sole master of the empire alienated many who were ambivalent to his rule and embittered many who had been his greatest friends. Mark Antony, though, despite the recent falling out with his old friend and numerous overtures from the conspirators, refused to join the ranks of the disaffected deceived, and on his way back to Rome from Spain, with his young great-nephew Octavian by his side, Caesar picked up Antony from his political doghouse in Gaul, and the two old friends patched things up. But while Antony's support never wavered, a man in whom Caesar's support for never wavered, Marcus Brutus, would soon find himself at the forefront of the plot to kill his would-be father figure. The main controversy surrounding Caesar after his return to Rome in September of 45 BC, and the one that was the primary catalyst for his assassination, was the question of whether or not he was planning to have himself crowned king. Not being a dummy, Caesar always went to great lengths to prove that he had no desire to establish a monarchy, but the rumor persisted, and overt attempts to so crown him kept popping up, quote-unquote, spontaneously. Throughout the year 45, while he continued to serve officially as consul, this time he had not bothered with the formality of naming a colleague, and he seemed to be drifting more and more towards overt autocracy. And unfortunately for Caesar, just as his attitude was becoming more haughty, his grasp on public relations, once his greatest asset, began to slip. First, Caesar proved that he had learned nothing from the outrage over his last triumph and staged an official event to celebrate his victory in Spain. Again, the people of Rome were dismayed by a parade glorifying the defeat of their countrymen. The sons of Pompey may have been personal enemies of Caesar, but were they really public enemies of Rome? Second, Caesar managed to get himself embroiled in a pointless public spat with Cicero over the legacy of Cato. The great orator had published a eulogy of his dead colleague, lavishly praising the old defender of the Republican faith. Caesar flew into a rage, and against all good sense, wrote a scathing reply called the Anti-Cato, in which he lobbed every smear he could think of against his old rival. Cicero was taken aback by the fury of Caesar's reaction, but delighted in how unhinged the attack seemed. Cato may have been a lot of things, but a drunken miser who pimped his wife was not among them, though the latter charge, through some tortured logic, had some basis in truth. Cato had divorced his wife so she could marry another, richer man, and then, when the new husband died, remarried her and reaped the rewards of her inheritance. The people of Rome, though, did not see what Caesar wanted them to see about Cato. They focused instead on his petulant hysterics, a side of Caesar they had never seen before and did not like. His enemies could not print copies of the Anti-Cato fast enough. In the midst of these public offenses, little things kept popping up that renewed fears of Caesar's monarchical ambitions, and despite his protests, he certainly began to act the part of king. He secured the right to wear his triumphal regalia at public games, which may have seemed like no big deal, but the triumphal regalia was purple, just like the royal robes of old. Add to this the golden throne he had installed in the Senate House to sit in, and a pattern started to emerge. To top things off, he ordered that a statue of himself be carried along with the procession of gods that would make its way through the city on holy days. So not only was he planning to make himself king, but he was already claiming to be a god. One morning, the citizens of Rome awoke to find that someone had placed a crown on a public statue of Caesar during the night. Two tribunes, vocal opponents of Caesar, ordered that the crown be removed and made a great fuss about the outrage. And not long after this incident, while he made his way through town, Caesar was hailed as king by a man in the crowd. The same two tribunes had the man hauled off to stand trial, but Caesar ordered the man freed and instead turned his wrath against the two agitating tribunes, stripping them of their property and forcing them to resign from office. What remains a mystery is whether Caesar himself